the chair of the exam committee, and so my role here is just to tell you what our procedures are, and then I will hand over to Colette for an introduction. And so basically, Ishir is going to present his work. We would ask that you reserve questions until the end, and then we'll have a question and answer period that I'll moderate. And then after that, we will need to ask everyone to leave the room, and we will proceed to the private part of the class. Any questions about the logistics? All right, so then I would hand over to Colette to introduce her.
Good morning, everyone. It's really my pleasure to be here to get to introduce Ishir Dutta and his PhD defense. So Ishir is originally from India, from Delhi. He came to the US for his undergraduate degree at Colgate. He graduated in 2017 with degrees in physics and math. Colgate, for those of you who don't know, is in upstate New York, so perhaps fleeing the cold. He then moved to the West Coast, to the Bay Area, for a couple of years when he worked for Big Switch Networks. And then he decided to take the plunge and do the PhD. So the fall of 2019, he joined us here at MIT in the Department of Earth, Atmospheric and Planetary Sciences. And he will be telling you today about all the work that he has done since he arrived. So, sure.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Arlene and Colette, for a nice introduction. Thank you all for being here. I was a little worried this was too large a room, but I guess that word was a little unfounded. Thank you all for being here. Thank everyone on Zoom. I'm really stoked to talk to you guys about some of the work I've been doing over the last 6 years, although most of you seem to have thought it was 7 for some reason, because it has to do with my pacing. If not, it's almost 6. You know, also, most of you don't actually know what I've been working on. Something to do with nitrogen, even some faculty have said. So hopefully you'll know a little bit more about both what I'm doing and about nitrogen in the atmosphere. So let's get started. Just as a, can you see my laser pointer here? Yes, excellent. Okay, we'll start really bare bones, really basic. What are the major components of Earth's atmosphere? It's mostly nitrogen and oxygen, mostly molecular oxygen and nitrogen. Oxygen's about 20% of the atmosphere. We all are familiar. We breathe it. We wouldn't be here without it. Nitrogen is the other big component. It's about 78% molecular nitrogen. It's a really, really stable molecule. It's got this triple bond that's really hard to break. And all the other stuff is about 1%. So methane, water vapor, carbon dioxide, all the fun stuff that people in atmospheric chemistry study is a small, oh, yes. Yeah. It's a small fraction of the reactive. Okay.
I was covering your title.
It's covering my title. Oh, I can move that. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So what is reactive? We're gonna get there. So that's not reactive nitrogen. That's very stable nitrogen. And I borrowed this. Since Andrew, oh, it's not mad. It's not me. Let's see. Can I? We'll have to bring my pointer back to the screen. There we go. All right. So this really stable molecular nitrogen is made reactive by a number of natural processes. Bacterial activity, wildfires, lightning strikes have enough energy to split this really stable bond. And I borrowed this from Andrew Evans' group since he graciously canceled a group meeting this morning so that all of you could be here. And so it cycles between this really stable form of molecular nitrogen in the bottom left to all this sort of, some reactive nitrogen shown up here. The focus of today will be oxidized reactive nitrogen. And so that's in the top right quadrant here, well, semicircle, I guess. And the other big form is reduced nitrogen, which is in the bottom right. That's a topic for another day. So that's NOY, which many of you have heard me say over the last year or so. And that's going to be the bulk of the dissertation. Now, other than natural processes over several million years, in the last century and a half, human activities have really perturbed this nitrogen cycle by adding a bunch of sources, both reduced nitrogen as ammonia emissions, it's mostly fertilizer, and nitrogen oxide, so oxidized reactive nitrogen. This is mostly from burning fossil fuels. And that obviously has some ramifications for this delicate balance of the nitrogen cycle. It also so happens that reactive nitrogen is really, really important to drive tropospheric chemistry, that little 1% slice of trace gases. And I've shown here nitrogen oxides in the top left. I pulled this figure from Kroll et al. that shows the central role of these nitrogen oxides in driving tropospheric chemistry. As you can see, this nitrogen cycling, NOx cycling, is responsible for the production of atmospheric oxidants like ozone. It's also a greenhouse gas. It's also pretty nasty to breathe when you're at the surface, when it's at the surface. It's responsible for the production of the OH radical, which is the key oxidant in the atmosphere that drives, this sort of like low temperature fire of anything we put in the atmosphere. And then, you form other reactive nitrogen products like nitric acid, H3 over there, further along the top right chain. That is a component of acid rain, which is also obviously pretty nasty stuff, depending on the context. There's also this sort of complex cascade of chemistry all the way through to form particulate matter, which forms haze that we are familiar with in Delhi on the right. And then the sort of canonical example of ozone is on the left. This is a picture from LA from the 1940s. So you should care about air quality, you care about reactive nitrogen. You care about ecosystems, you care about reactive nitrogen. On the left, I've shown exposure to plant tissue to ozone over an extended period of time. And obviously ecosystems, as you can imagine, are pretty pH sensitive. So any introduction of nitric acid, form of nitrogen or sulfur in some cases, would lead to the disturbance of this pH balance of any ecosystems and the organisms that live within them. Finally, I mentioned briefly that ozone is also a greenhouse gas, and that has climate implications, so it contributes to some warming. It's a figure from the IPCC that shows the range of forcing contributions of different components of the atmosphere. And the thing that I pointed out earlier is NOI chemistry contributes both to ozone radiative forcing, so that like positive forcing there that causes warming, as well as the production of aerosols as fine particulate matter that generally cause some cooling but have mixed effects. All right, so that's roughly why you should care about reactive nitrogen. And so with that in mind, maybe it's worthwhile to start with a primer on atmospheric chemistry for those of you who are less familiar with what our field does. And very basically, it's these three buckets, right? Stuff gets into the atmosphere by emission. It undergoes chemistry, it sort of changes into other stuff, some of which I showed in that Kroll figure. It's transported by wind, so there's advection. And then finally, what goes up must come down, and it's deposited either by wet deposition, so think rain, think snow, or dry deposition, so turbulence, settling of particles, so on and so forth. So what are the tools that we use to study this system? Our group is a modeling group, and so we use chemical transport models. And what these models generally do is they just slice up the atmosphere into little boxes. You can see here, going up and around the Earth's surface. And within each box, we do a bunch of things, right? So we do chemical production. So, well, let me start with emission. So we have some emission of some substances, whether anthropogenic or natural box. They undergo chemistry, production, and loss into other species, and then their eventual deposition. That's D. And then between the boxes, there's obviously some wind, some effects of advection, and so this mass moves along through the atmosphere, and we track it as it moves. We don't just sit in computer fantasy land. We also think it's valuable to check our models against observations. And some of the work I'll be talking about today will use aircraft campaign observations. So essentially, we fly planes that are loaded up with instruments that sample air through different parts of the atmosphere and tell us what's in that part of the atmosphere at that time. And we also use surface networks. So this is essentially you set up shop at a remote location or a city location, and you put up your instruments there, and you sample either rain or actively sample air or passively sample air to learn something about the local environment. And then these networks are really powerful because they give you this sort of spatially heterogeneous view of a particular region. All right, so we know roughly what atmospheric chemistry is. We know roughly what NOI is, and we know some of the tools we're going to be talking about today. And so I'll start with chapters 1 and 2, which are breaking down the sort of broad-based characteristics of this NOI chemistry. It's kind of a state of the science description of our understanding of NOI as it is. As I mentioned, reactive nitrogen chemistry is really important to tropospheric chemistry, and so it has been included in some form in our earliest models, going back to the 70s. This is a figure from Levy et al., which is one of my favorite figures of all time, mostly because it's really symmetric, but also partially because it's a really nice primer in the big fluxes in the reactive nitrogen system. So we really can see what are the important species, what are the important processes that are driving interconversions between reactive nitrogen species in the atmosphere. And so you can see some of the salient features here. If you're emitting NOx, say by fossil fuels, or by soil, or by lightning, this NOx rapidly cycles. During the daytime, it may form HONO, which here is labeled HNO2 sometimes. There's a really important daytime source of oxidants because it's photolized. You form the nitrate radical, which is a really important oxidant during the nighttime when there's no light around, and the eventual formation of nitric acid, which equilibrates to form particulates that then may eventually rain out. So that was then, and this is now, some 40 years later, 50 years later, there's an explosion in models. There's not just one or two models, we have a handful of them. I pulled this figure, really nice figure from Murray et al. From a few years ago that summarizes some of our current understanding of NOI chemistry. And so what they've done is they've plotted the relative abundance and the absolute abundance of 4 key NOI species. So NO, NO2, which form NOx, HNO3, which is the main sink of NOx. It's it's nitric acid. It's characteristically thought of the sink of NOx in the atmosphere, and PAN, which is a key reservoir species that is also a component of photochemical smog. And on the y-axis is different models, and they're plotting the burdens on the x-axis. As you can see, between models, there's pretty wide disagreement. There's about a factor of 4 difference in just these basic 4 species relative abundance. And so there's some disagreement. We don't really know why. It's pretty critical chemistry. And so some of our work is to, one, try and more comprehensively characterize the NOI budget beyond just these 4 species, and then also try and quantify explicitly some of the key fluxes that govern transformations between NOI species. And we're hoping this can maybe help us understand what the processes driving these differences between models, and maybe squeeze some of our error bars. The tools we'll be using for this project are our favorite chemical transport model, GeoSChem, which is a model that everyone in our group uses. It's maintained by us down at Harvard and also WashU. And we'll be combining the model, we'll be grounding the model with some data from the ATOM flight campaign, which is a set of 4 flights between 2016 and 2018 that cover northern and southern hemisphere remote troposphere across 4 seasons. So we get springtime, summertime, fall, and winter. And the plane essentially flies through the troposphere from like 200 meters to 12 kilometers in this sort of cyclic fashion. And I'm very grateful for the data, but I'm also very glad that I sit at my laptop all day instead of in a plane that's cycling through the atmosphere. So many thanks to the folks the brave folks who've taken that data. So to start, we'll look at the data, and we'll sort of use this data to ground our model, make sure that our model is the appropriate tool to use in this situation, if it can capture the chemistry seen in these regions. So on the left, I've shown a stacked vertical profile. So the independent variable is on the y-axis rather than the x. So for those of you for whom that's new, maybe that's good to note. That's something I had to learn coming from physics. And the dependent variable, so the abundance of different NOI species, is on the x-axis. On the left side, you see observations. On the right side, you see the model representation. And overall, the model does a pretty good job of capturing the shape and extent of the vertical profiles. There's pretty good agreement between the two. You might say, well, that's not quite right, because there's a little bit of a high bias, and you're right. And most of it is attributed to nitric acid. As you can see, there's a little bit more nitric acid in the model, well, little to a lot bit more of nitric acid in the model than in the observations. But this is a consistent bias, it's well known, it's existed for long before I moved into atmospheric chemistry, and it'll probably persist for a little while longer. But at least it grounds our understanding of what we're producing. Now, this is just one season, this is just the Northern Hemisphere. If we zoom out and look at all the data across hemispheres, across seasons, we see that this general characterization still holds up. The shape of the vertical profiles is preserved in these pairwise. So we have ATOM 1, 2, 3, and 4, split by northern and southern hemisphere. On the model, there is a high bias, and most of it is attributable to this 3 section. All right, with that said, we can now move into model world, where I'm a little bit more comfortable, and we can start to assemble a budget. And you might ask, how to assemble a budget? It's quite a simple concept. All you have to do is add up all the emission, add up all the deposition, chemical production, chemical loss, and find what the equilibrium state of a particular species is, and do that across all reactive NOI species. So let's do a worked example. PAN, as I mentioned, is an important component of smog. and it is the key reservoir of NO in the atmosphere. And it has a pretty simple chemistry. So maybe let's start with that. It's produced through reaction of the peroxyacetyl radical with NO2. This is a temperature-dependent reaction, and that is responsible for all the formation in the model. It's almost entirely lost through the same thermal decomposition. As you can see, about 132 grams of production and about 129 grams of loss are through this sort of thermal formation and loss. There's a small photolytic loss, mostly in the upper troposphere, that produces a litany of other radicals. There's a comparably small depositional loss, so this is mostly dry deposition, and an almost negligible wet loss. All right, everyone with me so far? So we're going to do this for every NOI species. I'm going to look like that for about 10 minutes. Candace sent me this really lovely email after my seminar last month, and I know she's being nice, so I'm going to take that as a compliment. But I will look like that for the next 10 minutes, so please bear with me. All right, this is what happens when we do this for all NOI species. And it's complicated, so don't take it all in. We'll break it down together. But you are familiar with some of the basic components of this figure, right? So in the blue bubbles, the dark blue bubbles, you can see the burdens of different NOI species. They're scaled to their relative abundance in the atmosphere, right? In the vertical arrows, you can see on the far left there's a red emissions arrow. So that's the main source of NOI in the atmosphere. There are other vertical arrows that are downward facing that reflect deposition fluxes. Blue is wet deposition, yellow is dry deposition. And then all the spaghetti, the light blue spaghetti, represents chemical fluxes or interconversions between different NOI species, or buckets, really. All right, so let's break this figure down a little bit more. As I said, the red arrow is almost all the source of NOI in the atmosphere. There's a small HNO3 source, but we won't get into that today. Almost all of this NOx is anthropogenically emitted. Depending on the region, there's some contribution from natural sources. This includes wildfires, so biomass burning, some lightning, and some soil NOx, so microbial activity in the soil produces NOx as well, between like 15 to 40%, depending on the region. But again, in the global troposphere, human activity is the largest contributor to reactive NOx. All right, and then what are the key species? What are the biggest bubbles on this figure, right? Because historically, models have included these 4 buckets. And in fact, that's what we see. These are the 4 key buckets. NO, NO2, so our NOx bucket, and then PANS and HNO3 are the most abundant. All right, so we've emitted this NOx. It's cycling as NOx itself. It's forming other stuff. And then eventually it has to be removed. So what is driving this removal? You might say, okay, let's look at what arrows are moving away from NOx in the spaghetti diagram. And some of you, especially those in the second row, might gravitate towards this arrow, which is the formation of organic nitrates. So RONO2 is just, R is just a methyl group or an organic group. And so that's an organic gas phase organic nitrate that is formed by these peroxy radicals that Hannah has done a lot of lovely work on recently, and reacting with nitrogen oxide to form these gas phase organic nitrates. Those of you who know more about organic nitrate formation will also say, what about the BVOC plus NO3 pathway? And you're correct, that contributes almost equally to these gas phase nitrates, although that is not a net NOx loss, it is a nitrate radical loss. Once these are formed, they may then either be recycled, mostly through photolysis or oxidation by OH, or they undergo reactive uptake in the model to form particle phase organic nitrates in about equal measure. What's basically, okay, we still haven't removed the NOI from the system. We've just like cycled through a bunch of stuff. And finally, these particles undergo really, really rapid hydrolysis in the model to form nitric acid that equilibrates into the particle phase to form aerosol phase nitrates. These form, this bottom couple, form the total nitrate system, the inorganic nitrate system. That is, again, classically thought of as a key terminal sink of NOI. Once you form this, you typically just remove it. It doesn't recycle. Is the classical picture. We'll come back to that. However, that's not the major loss pathway for NOx. For that, we need to take a little bit closer look at the spaghetti diagram. And if you look in the middle, you'll see that this oxidation of NO2 by the OH radical is in fact the most important actual net loss for NOx. So you oxidize NO2 by OH to form nitric acid. Again, we're forming nitric acid. This equilibrates with into the particle phase, and then is wet or dry removed. And that, again, drives, if you look closely, most of the downward facing deposition arrows are associated with this total nitrate system. And so the actual loss of NOI from the atmosphere is driven by these two species. And that sets the general lifetime of NOI in the troposphere. The red colors are longer lifetimes, the cooler colors are shorter lifetimes, and the overall global lifetime of NOI is about 5 days, generally mediated by this wet deposition and dry deposition of total nitrate. All right, I've harped on a little bit about how this total nitrate is a terminal thing. And for those of you who've seen this figure before, heard this talk before, hold the punchline. There is an arrow. There is a chemical flux arrow coming off nitrate, particle phase nitrate. So it isn't actually a terminal sink. And this is an active area of research. Some recent work within the last 10 years has suggested that instead of a terminal sink, the total nitrate system may be thought of as a temporary reservoir, or at least partially a reservoir. And this photolysis is comparable, about 12 teragrams per year, to some of the depositional loss of aerosol phase nitrate. So it's not negligible at all. However, it's an active area of research. It's quite uncertain. There's more work to be done here to narrow this range. There was a paper that came out of Matt Evans' group. There's a preprint out as of last week, I think, that suggests that this flux is in fact around on the order of about 40 teragrams a year. They use a different parameterization than we do. All right, so let's come back to this figure from Murray et al. We tried to explain the spread. We tried to get a more comprehensive characterization of our model. And so I cleaned up Lee's figure a little bit and added in our data. So this is the same figure, I just put it on a slightly different scale so you can see a little bit better. Our results are on the top. And as you can see, they fit pretty squarely within the range of other models as well. These are modeling a decadal average of the 2000s, so it's obviously a little bit different. Our simulation is for 2016, but it's still broadly within the simulated range. In addition to these 4 species, as I promised, we've added some more detail. And so we've added aerosol phase inorganic nitrates, aerosol phase organic nitrates, a litany of other acyl and peroxynitrates, and some other small components. So the nitrate radical, N2O5, HONO, and PNA. Finally, I did promise that, maybe there's some uncertain chemistry, it's not super well constrained, and it might be worthwhile to probe some of these processes to see what their net effect is on the global tropospheric budget. And so we did a few of these. I'm going to show you an example of one. So we did one sensitivity in which we switched off this recycling of nitrate into NOx. So switching off this sort of relatively new process, what does that do to the overall burden? So I've shown changes to the overall burden on the top. As you can see, it's quite small. And the net effect is roughly what we would predict, right? So in the case where we switch off renoxification, our fraction of NOx does go down. This is on the far left, that's the 13% NO2. And our fraction of the total nitrate, so HNO3 plus aerosol phase nitrates, does go up. We've done a few other tests. I'm not going to get into them now, but if you'd like to talk about them, we can talk about them afterwards. But the key point really is that this one process alone, and none of the processes we tested, are able to explain the wide variability we see across models. And so I think it might be worthwhile to do a more thorough counting across models to see where there are differences lie. All right, to wrap up, oh my goodness, wow, okay. It's just been sharing longer than I thought. I thought I was 50 minutes in. All right, to wrap up this chapter, some key takeaways. We found the model does a pretty good job of representing global remote tropospheric chemistry. We've, for the first time, comprehensively quantified the flow of reactive nitrogen species as they move through the atmosphere from emission to their transformations and then to their eventual deposition. There's obviously still more chemistry to learn. Like, I haven't solved everything, unfortunately. And I think expanding our approach, our framework to other models might help us understand what drives these differences and where we might be missing some things. All right, to move to the second part of this talk, I'll be spending a little less time in model world and a little bit more time in the real world. And we'll be looking at deposition data. So we'll sort of run this cycle backwards. Instead of going from emissions to deposition, we'll go from deposition to try and learn something about emissions. So let's go back to this figure I showed you on one of the first slides. As you can see, there have been really, really rapid and pretty dramatic changes in our emissions of NOx over the last century or so. And I'd like to study this trend. Why would we like to study these trends? Now, we obviously recognize that introducing these reactive species into the atmosphere has all sorts of negative consequences. And so they've been subject to wide-ranging policies in Europe, in North America, in China, and in India. Like basically every country on the planet has some regulation on NOx emissions. And so ideally, we'd like to see whether our regulations, our policies are doing what we think they are, if things are moving in the right direction. And so we'd like to study emissions. Emissions are really, 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 really hard to study because what it entails is you have to say, okay, there are so many cars on the road and they burn about this much fuel and they drive about this far and this is where they are. And we have like so many tractors and farms and so many power plants and this is how much gas they burn. It's a really atrociously difficult exercise. I'm not the one doing it, luckily, but the lovely people at the EPA do every 4 or 5 years. And they put out this really comprehensive bottom-up inventory that does an accounting of the NOx that we emit in the US. And so this is the slice that I showed you, the declining slice of NOx emissions from 1990 to 2020. Two is the latest data set. And that's a continuous decrease of about 3% per year. However, these are pieced together. This is sort of our best estimate. These are pieced together from different emissions inventories across these 5-year slices that use different methods. They update their methods. They use updated data sets. And so there are some discontinuities. So we'd like to find a way to use a continuous, consistent data set to validate this trend. Some of the tools we'll use are, of course, the emissions inventory. So this is a plot of NOx emissions from one of the EPA inventories from NEI 2011. And as you can see, you can see the sort of mobile source NOx really clearly in the roadways, and you can see a lot of urban sources. The Northeast corridor in particular has a lot of NOx. And then for the deposition side, we'll be using measurements from surface networks. This is the NADP, the National Atmospheric Deposition Program, that has been collecting wet deposition samples since the late 70s. It's a really, really awesome resource that is very, very spatially heterogeneous. It's grown over time. Essentially what they do is they put out buckets into a field, and the buckets open when it rains, collects the water, shuts when it stops precipitating, and then we send it off to a lab to see what's in that. So people like Nikki can tell me what's actually in the water. All right, the second set of data is from the CastNet network. This is a dry depositional observation network. And so it essentially it actively samples air at about 10 meters. And we collect the samples on filter backs that are then tell us the concentrations of what was in the air at the time over that integrated 1-week period. And then we use a model to infer what the dry deposition velocity was, therefore what the dry deposition in these locations are. So that should give us a relatively complete picture of total deposition in these regions. We have a picture of emissions in these regions, and we'll use our trusty translator chemical transport model, GeosChem, to act as an intermediary between the two. You'll probably be thinking, all right, this is a US study. You don't have the benefit of the closed system. And you're right, that is a really important caveat. This only works if the system is pretty closed, right? So if we're losing a ton of emissions over the Atlantic to Canada to Mexico, it's not a closed system. And you'll have a harder time constraining emissions from this endpoint depositional data. Luckily, lifetimes of HNO3 and nitrate are pretty short over the US, between 2 and 7 days. And so it's pretty closed, and we verified this with a model simulation in which we find that at least half of deposition measured in the US comes from US anthropogenic sources. It goes as high as about 80% in the eastern US. So it's not quite closed because it can't be perfectly closed, but it's closed enough for our purposes. We did a few tests to see whether our sites were representative of the region, and it turns out they are. The second constraint is, of course, like, is the model the right tool to study this problem? Can it even represent deposition concentrations well enough for us to use? And this is on the left-hand side, the left panel, I've shown a model observation comparison of aggregate data from both wet and dry sites across the speciated. So you see HNO3, you see nitrate across both wet and dry deposition. The wet is in blue, the dry is in warmer colors. The left-hand side is the observations, and the right-hand side is the model. The model does a really, really good job of capturing wet deposition. It's slightly more challenged by dry deposition, but we think that this is more an artifact of the models, of the dry deposition measurements actually being inferential rather than direct observations. So we're actually measuring concentrations, and we're using a translational model to estimate the dry deposition velocities that give us the actual deposition fluxes. And so to test that, we used an alternate set, also from the EPA, of dry deposition magnitudes. So the smaller scatter is here in black, and the alternate set is in gray, and there's a slightly better agreement with higher dry deposition velocities. However, this is again, like, it's pretty hard to measure deposition, and it's sort of still an active area of research, is something that we need to build on. The more important thing is we need to consider these biases in the model are consistent over time. And we checked, and they are. And so while we can't say anything about these sort of absolute magnitudes, we can use this data to extract relative changes in deposition and emission. So coming back, my emissions figure, I've now put it in relative space, so that's 100% going down to 30%-ish, decreases about 3% per year. And if I overlay the aggregated dry deposition data, again in relative space, because it's sort of like, depends on it's dealer's choice on which data set you use. I've shown the data set from the observation as the yellow line, and then we run model simulations every 5 years, and those are the crosses. So our model does a really nice job of following the observation data, which does a really nice job of following anthropogenic NOx emissions, which is kind of awesome. Largely because dry deposition is governed by H3 deposition, which dry deposits pretty rapidly. Now, I haven't said anything about wet deposition data, which was actually the initial focus of this project. That does a worse job. Any thoughts on why that may be? No thoughts. All right. The key word is anthropogenic. There are other sources of NOx. There's soils, there's lightning. And if we account for those, this is modeled emissions of total emissions in the region. That agrees really well with wet deposition. And that sort of reflects the transport and the transformation of these species into aerosol form nitrates that dominate wet deposition before they reach our receptor sites. All right. A few key takeaways from this chapter are, I hope I didn't spend too long on this, but it's really, 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 really hard to come up with an emissions inventory. You have to do, it's incredibly labor intensive, it's incredibly resource intensive, and we do this, we can only afford to do this every few years. And in the interim, we still need to study the atmosphere, and so any additional constraints we can add are good value. So we set out with the hope of finding whether we could use this consistent, spatially heterogeneous, long-running deposition data set in the US to say something about emissions trends. Turns out the model can do a good enough job for our purposes of representing this chemistry. And we demonstrated in this chapter that we can, in fact, use dry deposition and wet deposition data in this region to constrain trends. Now, oh, sorry. All right. I'll come back to some more implications of this work in a bit. Just to give you an overview of what we've talked about so far, I want to emphasize, when I was looking back at writing this thesis, the driving principles have been almost unsettlingly simple. I remember when I started, I was like, oh, Colette, should we do something with like clustering? Should we do like some representation? Or should we like try and see, there's all this seasonality. Should we look at this data in this weird, funny way? She was like, do the basics first, why don't you? And it turns out the basics work really, really well. For the first chapter, our basic principle was mass balance. It's what you learn in high school chemistry. You cannot create matter, you cannot destroy matter, you can only transform it. And we use that sort of mass balance principle to track every molecule of NOI, from emission to deposition to everything in between. And that's kind of awesome. So we were able to construct this really comprehensive budget of tropospheric NOI. It also enabled us to test particular processes. So once we've got this full mass balance accounting, we can rip out a process or we can add a process and see what a singular process's effect is on the entire system. And finally, in a more grounded test case, we demonstrated that understanding this chemistry allows us to use these long-running data sets that we've had to constrain emissions even today. that was then, this is now. I put up Hiram Levy's figure, Chip Levy's figure. I don't know him as Chip, so I'm going to say Hiram. On the left and mine on the right. It's broadly the same. Mine looks a bit messier. It's not quite as aesthetically pleasing, but it's still beautiful. There's some snickers, so maybe it's not quite so good. But I want to emphasize there's still so many opportunities to learn more about this chemistry. We've learned a lot in the last 50 years, but there's still some work to be done. And I would say, I would hope that other people using other models are able to use our framework for budgets to characterize more comprehensively what NOI is doing, maybe track down some of the more key fluxes, see how they're different, see how they respond to changes, how they're sensitive to some changes in those fluxes. And as you'll note, I've mostly, despite one brief detour, I've mostly just talked about inorganics. Organic chemistry is a whole different beast, and it's way more complicated. It's an active area of research. It's quite uncertain. It's very, it's represented in a really rudimentary way in models. And I think that's another area of research that is quite promising, is really interesting, is really cool, especially if you're someone like Hannah, who's grinning at organics. I also think that most of the work I've shown is either global tropospheric, and the work I've shown in the second half has been focused on a US-based network. There are other deposition networks. There's a European deposition network. There's a growing group of countries that have aligned to put together their deposition data in East Asia. And so I think it'd be cool to look at this data to see whether these principles can apply in other regions of the world. It's also the case that a lot of our atmospheric chemistry measurements are concentrated in wealthier countries in the US or North America, in Europe, and now there's a growing body of research in East Asia. But there's a lot of the atmosphere we still haven't studied. So I hope that this is a charge to do more in more places. I'm going to come back to acknowledgements after, but I will first take questions.
All right, so thank you so much, Ishir. So let's open up to questions. I'll just keep my Zoom here so I can monitor any online questions, which we also welcome.
Yes. Thank you, Ishir. That was a wonderful talk. Just wondering if you could say a little bit more on the reason why there's a biased high nitric acid in the middle to upper troposphere.
In the middle to upper troposphere.
In the models, more biased high.
Yeah. Like if I knew, we wouldn't be standing here. Is the short answer. So, but if I break it down on a more sort of like process level, like you know this, I'm just like gonna talk through like my thought process and why they might be high. I would say there are a few things, right? Like either our sources are too high, right? Or our sinks are they're not enough sinks, or their sinks are inadequately rapid. Now, the sort of example I always come back to when talking about sources are too high is Katie Travis's 2016 paper, where she was looking at southeastern US ozone. And she also used, I think, NEI 2011 and did a sensitivity where she cut emissions by 40 to 60%, I believe. And that did resolve some of the biases. But I don't think that it's appropriate, or maybe that works in the southeastern US. Maybe we are in fact overestimating emissions from mobile sources in the southeastern US by that much. But I doubt that's the case everywhere. And so the other lever we have to pull is the sinks. And so you might say, okay, maybe we're inadequately we're removing H2O3 and nitrate, aerosol nitrate, inadequately quickly. And as you know, that has also been tried. There's the group out of Albany that has been tinkering with the wet deposition scheme. They've cranked up the H2O3 uptake by a couple orders of magnitude, seen what that does. Turns out Katie has also tested that in her 2020 paper, and she found that does resolve some of the ATOM bias, H2O3 bias. But again, we found in our deposition work that switching on that scheme degrades the performance of our wet deposition measurements. So essentially what we're doing is we're sort of moving the bias from from the atmosphere to the ground. In the budget work, this is a three-part answer. This is the last part. In the budget work, you see that there's all this sort of like interdependence for sources of H2O3. And it's possible, I hadn't talked about this at all today, But there's halogen chemistry that's really important in mediating transformations between nitrogen radical, NO2, and NH3. That is very uncertain. It's an active area of research. The organics, this sort of like rapid particle phase organic hydrolysis is also maybe too high of a source. If I go back to my figure, although I don't know that that's wise for me to click back so far, so maybe I'll go back here. As you can see, the depositional loss of particle phase organic nitrates doesn't even show up on the figure because it doesn't crack 1 teragram. And I don't think that's quite right, because there's a study I cited in my dissertation from 2010 that made measurements of organic nitrate and inorganic nitrate in the Rocky Mountains, and they found summer and springtime organics were about half of what inorganics were. So they're comparable orders of magnitude. So we should see like roughly these numbers in regions that are like the Rockies. I hope that's covers most of it. Thank you.
I'm hoping you might be able to help me understand the heterogeneous or just the seasonal trends of some of these pathways. You represented this, in some fashion as kind of steady state, but I'm wondering, given the reliance of OH and the change of light over the course of a year, but also humidity, given the, so I'm just wondering if you can tell me more.
Do you want to talk about budget or deposition?
Whatever you want to talk about.
We can talk about budget, because that's maybe the bigger picture stuff. You're totally right. This is a limitation of the work, because essentially, I've written about this a little bit. It's a little underdeveloped in my conclusions, and I'd love to chat with my committee after this about how we can maybe develop that idea a little bit further. The simplifying assumption in using this sort of global approach is that you're working with a closed system, right? The second you say, I think one way you could get a diurnal cycle really matters, right? Like nighttime chemistry, daytime chemistry, and then seasonality obviously matters too. I think a way you could get around that is say, we want to study the NOI chemistry at a certain location. So you sample a grid box, you give like an hourly output for like a representative month for 4 months a year in different seasons. And that would give you a breakdown of what the diurnal cycle looks like, what the seasonality looks like. And I would imagine some basic stuff, right? Like a lot of the photolysis will shut down at night. The nitrogen radical chemistry will become more important at nighttime. You'll probably see more HONO in the morning. Like I would expect to see those shifts over time. But we couldn't do this. We couldn't do everything everywhere. Follow up?
Other questions?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So in your final section, when you're showing the modeling results of the wet deposition and dry deposition, I found it interesting that in absolute terms, there was a much larger discrepancy between the dry deposition model versus data compared to the wet deposition. But then when you translate to the relative space, the dry deposition follows the anthropogenic sources a lot better than the wet deposition follows the overall. So I was wondering if you had a sense of why that is.
Yes, I do. So I can show you, maybe this will be beneficial to look at. I have an extra figure for you. And here is the trend in deposition over time, speedscape. So as you can see, the relative bias stays pretty consistent. And so that's why we're able to track the relative changes. You're right that the dry dep tracks anthropogenic emissions really well, but that's because dry dep is dominated by HNO3, which gas phase HNO3, right? Like which deposits pretty rapidly near sources. So you oxidize NO2, form HNO3, you rapidly deposit it. The wet dep is dominated by particle phase nitrates, aerosol nitrates, which are sort of dependent on like abundance of ammonia. It's sort of dependent on abundance of like water vapor. Like it's a slightly longer process. And so what you're seeing in the like flattening is the effect of sort of like more regional effects than like near source regions. And so your anthropogenic sources dominate, right? And so that's why they track really well. They will stop tracking as well once we cut our NOx emissions to be far more comparable to natural sources. But in the meantime, they do track anthropogenics really well.
Any other questions? Oh, to online, actually. Okay. The Ishir says, great talk, learned so much in the past 2 years. Glad to see everything coming to a closure. Many questions, obviously stick with one for now. How easy or fast or even feasible is it to move away from chemistry-based models and use machine learning-based models to obtain similar results and follow up? Okay, so I think I'll pause and answer that. And that might be
it's one question with 3 parts, actually. Yeah, so for those of you who have talked to me about machine learning based models in the last 5 years, I'm not a fan. I bullshit, sorry. Do a better black box, and in that case, yeah, sure, whatever. But we are in a science department, and I think the point of doing science is to understand the underlying processes, and you can't do that with another black box. And so I think what drives my interest is more, really getting in the weeds and picking apart these models that we put together that are generally process-driven, and seeing what the variation between those is. There's some really nice work by Hill Group alum Sam Silva, who has raved in the past against the indiscriminate use of explainable AI. And I would encourage you to read a recent paper by him if you want more thoughts on that. I don't have very many other than thing bad.
Okay. So I think if you wanted to follow up more, right, it was kind of just what data would you need?
Kunal, if you want to, if you're listening, go ahead. Please use AI for chemistry and tell me all about it. I'll be watching from afar.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, let's see. Any other questions online or in the room? Go ahead, Sam.
Fantastic talk. I was watching, I was so hopeful that you'd say, and we've solved it. We know.
What would the next PhD student do?
That's very kind of you. I was curious though, you mentioned the need for more measurements and this idea of going to other regions. If you could wave a magic wand, what is the measurement or measurement campaign or measurement device or quantity that you think would give you the most advantage in cracking this problem?
How magic is this magic wand?
Within the realm of physics.
Right. Oh, so not that magic. What measurements would I advocate for? So I think what I ran into with the deposition work, I really spun my wheels on that. And that was partly because I was like switching fields and I was learning chemistry for the first time in 10 years, and partly because I had a hard time like wrapping my head around the problem, even though the concept's quite simple. It's not a closed system. And if you read my paper, it's like 11 figures of why this might not work, and then 1 figure of how it happens to work. And I would say I think an important thing we should do is it's awesome that we have surface networks of concentrations. It's awesome that we have surface networks of deposition. I think we should try and co-locate them as best as possible. A lot of them are co-located. That's great. So that gives us like simultaneous constraints on the sort of like concentration and deposition, so we're not moving biases around. And then also better characterization of organic fluxes. So like I mentioned to Yahweh, there's not widespread measurements or characterization of organic nitrate deposition, for example, which can in some regions be a pretty large contributor. I would also say actual dry deposition flux measurements are not really, like we're relying on concentrations translated through this sort of like deposition flux layer, deposition velocity layer to get our deposition fluxes that can vary pretty widely across models. It's also highly parameterized, as you know, and based on like the 1989 sort of resistance as a series paper. And I think some more work like doing a more physics-based approach of dry deposition, as well as like measurements of actual dry deposition fluxes, which will be localized, right? Because that's the nature of the work, would go some way in helping us see a clearer picture.
Okay, if there's not a burning question in the room, I'm going to go back online. Kroll is following up with a different question, not machine learning. But can you elaborate on the actual implications of such modeling work on policymaking and sort of how it could make a difference in the real world, and how you think the trend not quite sure I'm following this, but basically in terms of coming years, like what would you expect? I'll rephrase.
Banal's such a sweetie, he's lobbing me softballs. I would say this is policy implication. Like, we've installed scrubbers on power plants. We have catalytic converters in cars. We've cut NOx emissions. It's a precursor to PM, to ozone. Like, it's a massive success. We've cut NOx emissions in the US by like 90-something%. Well, SOx emissions by 90-ish%, NOx emissions by like 80-ish% in the last 3 decades. You see it, we can track it. The air is cleaner. My parents landed yesterday and they're like, the sky is blue. It's awesome.
Just like since we're talking about policy and these sorts of things, you mentioned that a significant source of your data came from collections coming from the EPA, and we're seeing a positive downward trend. I don't want to derail the questions too far, but I'm curious, like how the future of these data and like continued efforts to understand this system, like how do you see that? Do you see this as something that, regardless of public opinion, we're going to keep paying attention to this and gathering these data, or do you think that potentially this type of research might be in danger in terms of like collecting to continue developing this understanding?
I don't have to say potentially. I can say no, because we have these networks have had funding cuts in the last 5 years. Like some sites have shut down, and you're right. It is under normal circumstances. I would say this is sort of beyond the purview of like administrative changes, right? Like since the 70s, this has been a decades-long cross-administrative commitment to fund these sites, to expand them, to take these measurements, and I think, essentially what we're doing is we're saying, if we can't measure it, it doesn't exist. If we don't measure it, it doesn't exist, or we don't see it. But as I said, you do see it, right? Like the EPA has this really lovely archive that I pulled from at the start of my talk. I showed the image of the leaf with ozone exposure. There are all these images from around the US in the 70s and the 80s. I think it was commissioned by Nixon. So if you pull up the National Archives website, you can pick a city, pick a location around the US, and there's probably photographs from that city that show sort of what the state was. And I don't think we should, I'm not saying it was slide back to that tomorrow, but I think we forget how good we have it in this country sometimes. I remember last wildfire season, the sky was red, and I stepped out of my apartment and I was looking down at my phone because I was not paying attention to my surroundings. And I looked out, I was like, am I in Delhi? What's happening here? And it was disorienting, but I think we should keep an eye on the winds, and I don't think we appreciate that. I get to appreciate it every time I go home. I'm like, oh, well, I can't read that side. That's not great. So, long, winding answer, but no hope there. Some hope there. Some encouragement there. Call your senators.
Great. I have time for one more question. Go ahead.
So I know you're saying this is the assumption you're making is that it's a closed system, but do you think there's a future in Lagrangian analyses to improve the budget?
Hard question. I should have cut off questions and gone to acknowledgement. Do I think there's a future for Lagrangian models? I don't know. You should tell me that. I think there is. So there's some really interesting work that I found while doing the depth paper that basically used back trajectories from receptor sites to see what the sort of downward, the effect on deposition was from upwind sources. And that set of papers basically established what I found, that there's, based in my sensitivity tests, that there's a pretty linear relationship between cuts to upwind sources and deposition observed to depth inside. So we just happen to be using an Eulerian model. You could do a similar thing with the Lagrangian model.
All right, so why don't we let you go ahead with your acknowledgements, and then we'll close out.
Okay. I had to put it in a different PowerPoint because it got too large. Okay, I'm gonna go through this really quickly. I'm gonna try not to cry. But first and foremost, I'd really like to thank all the funding I received. I made a switch from physics to math. It was not an easy switch. It was not a straightforward switch. And I wasn't able to do that by graduate fellowship funding in my first year. That kind of was a blue sky. I got to take whatever classes I wanted. It was really nice. And I've received federal funding all through my PhD. We'd like to keep that around. I hope I've convinced you that it's worthwhile. I'd really like to thank Colette for navigating this dynamic. We are very, very different people this way. And she has found ways to make light of that and work with that and make this a productive working relationship. Not always, but sometimes. And I hope we found some sort of way to produce full science together. But it turns out we're not so different. I took this picture almost exactly 10 years ago today. And I was so uncomfortable. I hate taking photographs. There are not a lot of photographs on the next few slides. My time in Cambridge is not well documented. However, this one is. And I also took a screenshot walking from the dome to Area 4 for lunch 10 years ago. And it turns out Colette happens to be on the menu at Area 4. So despite our differences, we did have some stuff in common. And that's the stuff that really matters. I'd like to thank the committee who've been really Justine and Colette are just such fabulous examples of good scientists, decent people. As are Arlene and Tim. I've really enjoyed working with all of them over the last few years. I was really nervous about my first committee meeting a couple of years ago, because any exam taking is kind of hard. It feels evaluative. You feel a little bit under a microscope, and I walked out just like walking on sunshine. They're just such lovely, supportive people who read the work, engaged with the work, care about it, care about people engaging with it, reading it, distributing it. I've really enjoyed working with Tim too on a project that I haven't talked about here. He's encouraged some whimsy, some love for physics. It provided me an escape from chemistry when I needed a familiar home. And the Heal and Kroll groups have been really the cornerstone of my time here. It's been so lovely. You guys are awesome. We've got to travel. I've got to skate really badly, enjoy no fights at the Bruins games, many other things that are, again, very poorly documented. This is not a representative sample. Lots of friends in Cambridge, lots of snacks, lots of late nights. My office mates have been fabulous. And you can see me consuming my annual dose of nitrates here in hot chocolate. And obviously family, friends here afar have been a constant source of support. It's been really lovely. Thank you for being here.